All right. Good morning, Penn State fans. We're having all kinds of fun here to kick things off. Yes, good morning, Penn State fans. It's BWI Live, Wednesday, February 12th. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel from Blue White Illustrated. The offseason is now officially underway for Penn State football. James Franklin holding his first news conference of the offseason since Penn State ended its 2024 season in the college football playoff semifinals after a loss to Notre Dame. Of course, the offseason in a lot of ways, started then, but there's always two indicators, T. Frank, of when the offseason actually begins, and that's the Super Bowl coming and going, and then James Franklin's first news conference of the offseason. So we have a lot to get to on today's show. Obviously, Penn State is in the middle of a running backs coach search. James Franklin detailed some thoughts about that, and also some thoughts on Jim Knowles becoming the team's new defensive coordinator, which of course we discussed last Wednesday after another Tuesday news conference that introduced Jim Knowles in State College. So T. Frank, we also talked to the class of 2024, the second year Nittany Lions yesterday. So a lot to dive into. It is anything but a slow February Wednesday in the Penn State universe. Yeah. And let's get to it. How's your morning going?
Yeah, I don't remember anything from yesterday. That might be a problem for today's show. It's just like these things, they come in like, you know, when it rains, it pours, and you've got James Franklin comments, and you know, you can pick up on certain things in the moment, and then a lot of stuff just kind of washes by you. And since then, you know, trying to get stuff out to Blue White Illustrated members at bluewhiteillustrated.com, get your first impressions, and then you got to go back and you got to sort through all of it. But really, I'm trying to think back to what he said about Jim Knowles, and I don't really remember all that much because a lot of the other things that we're going to talk about today felt more important. It felt like that story had already been closed, even though we needed to talk to Franklin about it to get that information, that conversation. By the way, the context that he gave, you already got at bluewhiteillustrated.com because of the reporting that we've done with Nate Bauer and all of his great work during that hiring search on the message board. So maybe that's why, where I was just like, yeah, I already know all this information. So I kind of, I don't want to say tuned out because I shouldn't say that, but maybe my mind was going to other places while he was talking about that stuff.
Yeah, he called it a twisty-turny, as you note. Nate was reporting on this throughout the search, and it was very twisty-turny, but Penn State gets the job done, gets Jim Knowles. You're right, though. It's funny, that hiring happened about 2 weeks ago, and Jim Knowles was introduced a week ago today, and yet that feels like it happened about 2 months ago. Yeah. And so it's fascinating kind of how these things play out. I enjoyed James Franklin kicking off his news conference, just addressing the elephant in the room head on. I can't recall him ever doing anything like his opening statement yesterday, where he willingly talked about the running back coaching search. So let's get into that. Penn State is now on its, day number, 3 of its running backs coach search. News broke over the weekend that Ja'Juan Seider would be leaving the Nittany Lions to take a job at Notre Dame. Interesting to me that is still not officially announced, but I'm sure the hiring process is different at every school, and things take time to hammer down the final details. He is leaving, as James Franklin said, on Tuesday, and as we told you over the weekend at bluewhiteillustrated.com. So it's just a matter of Notre Dame sending out a press release basically at this point, right? Once all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. But James Franklin is on the search now for his second on-field assistant, or I guess one of his 10 assistants, you could probably better say, of the offseason. Only his third running backs coach, T. Frank, in the time he's been at Penn State. So Charles Huff, of course, led things off. Ja'Juan Seider has held that role and added titles along the way for the last 7 years, and now he is moving on, and a new running backs coach will have to come to Penn State and have the very difficult task of inheriting Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, and the rest of a very talented running backs room. So Pete Nakos from On3 and our guys at BWI reported Tuesday that a couple names have emerged. Oklahoma running backs coach DeMarco Murray, former Oklahoma running back, easy for me to say, is a name that has emerged on the candidate list, and former Temple head coach Dan Drayton has popped up as a name that is in the mix as well. Others are certainly on James Franklin's list too to look into. I thought, T. Frank, his comments were interesting, though, yesterday. He made a good point, and it's that the hiring cycle is, like everything in college football, out of tune with the rest of the calendar in so many different ways. This is not new territory for James Franklin. He had to hire a special teams coordinator around this same time a year ago. But just any initial thoughts, T. Frank, on those two names and just the direction of this search in general?
Yeah, so I don't know Stan Drayton that well, but just kind of a knee-jerk reaction to DeMarco Murray is, from what I remember of him as a player, he reminds me a little bit of Nick Singleton. A taller running back, 6'2", 227, kind of had an upright running style, made it to the NFL, played fairly well there. Obviously not a Hall of Famer or anything like that, but a guy who had found success. So it it's not about Nick Singleton and Katron Allen as much as it is. It's about the running back room and making sure that you find the next and develop the next Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. You recruit them and all those things. But in the margins of, hey, Quentin Martin is a tall running back as well. So do you have guys that understand that and do some of the challenges that come with being more of an upright runner, being a guy that has that sort of profile? And that was just the first thing of, oh, okay, yeah, I can kind of see how that could work for Nick Singleton. And we talk about this being an important year for those guys in development and getting to the next level. I don't know if it's a helpful thought, but it was the first thought I had.
Yeah, DeMarco Murray has a pretty good track record of being linked to open jobs and then ending up with a contract extension at Oklahoma. So we'll see if that ends up being the case here. He's been in Oklahoma since 2020. Stan Drayton, on the other hand, spent almost 3 seasons as Temple's head coach. He was fired after a 9-25 record with the Owls, but he's been a running backs coach forever. Cleveland native that is known as a good recruiter and a good developer of talent. So a pretty interesting name to have pop onto the radar. And I think, if you pair the two things together in terms of where, so I'll move on to that in just one sec. But James Franklin talking yesterday about, and this was in general, just in terms of buyouts being a part of contracts now for assistants, which didn't used to be the case. But when it comes to Stan Drayton, he was certainly, I'm sure, had a buyout at Temple to be fired. And so, assuming he was, the reason he was fired were performance based, which everything indicates that it was. So that's an interesting wrinkle too in terms of what it would cost Penn State to potentially bring him in if he was the guy. And of course, anytime you're hiring somebody, you might have to buy out their contract, or they may come with a buyout. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But yeah, I see in the chat, it's on a lot of people's minds. Messiah Mickens, the class of 2026 Penn State running back commit from Harrisburg, who Ryan Snyder caught up with this morning. Blue White Illustrated members can read all of the things he had to say about Jaywan Sider leaving and what it may mean for his future over there. But as you can see, if you're watching on the YouTube show, one of the quotes from Mickens made pretty clear as could be, that that there are schools contacting him, and they were contacting him before Jaywan Sider left, and they have certainly been in touch with him now. So Penn State, I think you would say, unsurprisingly, T. Frank will have a fight on its hands to keep Mickens in this class. But that's not it's not a shock for 2 reasons. Number one, because his position coach just left, but number 2, Cooper Cousins is the rare exception to the rule of guys who tend to commit as early as someone like Messiah Mickens did, are going to not just stop hearing from schools because they committed so early. So it's one of those deals where getting the early commitment is great, but as everyone listening knows, you got to get these recruitments to the finish line, whether the commitment comes 2 years before a prospect can sign or 2 days. And so we'll see how that all shakes out. But I thought if you go read Ryan's story over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, where it's $1 for 7 days of access to read stories just like that one, you will see, I thought his comments in general, T. Frank, were pretty grounded, pretty understanding of how these things work. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how some guys on the current roster took this news. And to me, I think that all of them, from Mickens to the guys we talked to yesterday, had the right approach of they're certainly bummed, but at the same time, they understand how these things work and what, goes into the quote unquote business decisions across college football.
The thing with Mickens, to kind of rewind for a quick second, is that he was in a position where he had shut down his recruitment, right? And this is one of the one thing that could make him open that back up is, they got to find out who the coach is that is going to replace him, and he is allowing for that in the way he's talking about it. But at the same time, like, it is a reality of all of these guys on the roster. I don't think Nick Singleton and Katron Allen are the guys that I would have been concerned about in this situation. To me, it'd be a young guy on the roster who maybe has shown some promise or was a high profile recruit, not just to go to Notre Dame with Sider, but to go anywhere where there's opportunity. And so when you have a situation like right now, it's a really, I don't want to say it's precarious, but there is a piranha feeding frenzy coming up here in a little bit, because one way or another, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen are done at Penn State after 2025. So you have the opportunity there, but you also have winners and losers. And is that group going to, maybe that you keep them through this year, but then, you've got to keep stacking talent, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And it's not a doom and gloom situation, but if you lose a couple guys this spring and then next year the door is open and then it's closed and somebody wins the job and somebody's upset that they didn't get the job, you can clear out a room really quickly, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So Penn State recruiting 2 running backs in each class is really important, and keeping Mickens on board is part of keeping that room stocked with talent that can come in and make a contribution early in their career. As a guy who's big and physical and is a really good runner, they've had a couple of those guys recently. So it's an important hire, but I also think it's not one that is going to make or break the entire room, given the credit that Penn State has built. And Greg, this is something you mentioned here, and this is the kind of where I wanted to circle back to some of your original points. Penn State's only had 3 running back coaches. What's the most consistent position on the roster in that time under Penn State and under James Franklin? And then what's the least consistent? Like, I'd even go to offensive line. Phil Troutwine, the building they've done, because they had Matt Limegrover and then they had Phil Troutwine after Herb Hand. And so, like, kind of the same thing. The stability of some of these positions, you have to have success. Stability isn't the only thing. But I find that if you can point to places that have made significant strides, you also find positions where they've had very little turnover in that assistant category.
Right. And it's very interesting if you look across the long history James Franklin now has at Penn State, sort of how his position groups have turned over coaches or not turned over coaches. And so, yeah, this is a situation where Penn State finds itself needing an assistant coach about a month and a half, I guess, before spring practice starts. Again, not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but I think James Franklin, and I think he probably knows this, and college football fans and people who follow any team should know this, but this is kind of going to be the norm, right? I mean, this is just the way it works with the NFL hiring cycle, with late changes at the college ranks and things like that. This is going to become more of the norm. I'm not saying Penn State will have a February coaching search every year, but I don't think the fact that it happened 2 years in a row is some kind of crazy anomaly. I just think that is a possibility in the age of college football in 2025. So we'll see. But yeah, you mentioned we talked to a couple guys yesterday, Quentin Martin Jr. and Corey Smith, both obviously Penn State running backs who played as freshmen and come back into this room for the second year in 2025, albeit under a different position coach, as we've just discussed. Both guys, I thought T. Frank, again, hit the right chords in terms of saying they understood. They talked to Jalen Sider, they understood it, and they're obviously eager to see who the next hire will be at Penn State in the running back room. James Franklin, I think this is an interesting point because it seemed obvious to me, but I think it probably is on the mind of many. Some people probably are wondering if, like, the players, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, especially as seniors, will have any kind of input in this process. James Franklin made pretty clear no. And
Quentin Martin make any sense.
Yeah, right.
Like, exactly. I don't understand the train of thought there. Again, because Nick Singleton and Katron Allen they're not finished products, but the die has been cast as far as who they are, their relationship to the program. I don't understand that beyond the quarterback, and like the quarterback has to have an offense that fits him generally to make sure that his best traits are being expressed on a regular basis, and that maybe there is a little bit more leverage there. But even then, it's not like the NFL where you sign a contract for 10 years and you're expecting your quarterback to be there if you have a franchise quarterback for 10 years. You get 4 years with a guy. You don't make a decision based on somebody or something that is temporary in your life in any other situation. Right. Good process. Like, it's just poor process. And it, like, when you think about it for more than 10 seconds, I don't understand the question. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. But at any rate, that's how that's going to work. I agree with you. And so, but yeah, so Quentin Martin Jr., Corey Smith, they were both asked if the portal had crossed their mind. Both said no. Of course, the portal's not open. So even if it did, they couldn't do anything right now anyway. But we're going to get into that spring practice conversation, and not necessarily those two guys specifically, of course, but just the general wonky schedule that comes with spring practice is something we're going to discuss here in a little bit. But T. Frank, I guess the last note I'll say on this running backs coach search as we talk at 10:15 Eastern time on February 12th is that we know James Franklin is usually pretty quick to get these things done. But at the same time, he made, I thought, a great point yesterday. And again, it's one that's obvious, but until you hear him say it, doesn't always occur to everyone, is that they want the best candidate, but it's not as easy as just saying these are, the best candidates list is not as long as people think. And there's a lot of obstacles to getting those people, especially now. I mean, we're at a point where a lot of assistant coaches at any level have signed new contracts that probably include more money and thus probably include more buyout. And so that does not necessarily apply to every candidate, but it's just another part of the process here. And I think, fortunately for James Franklin and Penn State, the offensive staff consistency, aside from Jaywan Sider, Andy Kotelnicki, again, it was sometime in December, he said he was not going to pursue that West Virginia job and come back to Penn State. That feels like it was over a year ago that happened. But there's consistency, of course, from the top of the Penn State offense, and that's a good sign, and a lot of key players back as well. So whoever they get, I think things will work out fine for Penn State. And, I think Penn State fans should wish Jaywan Sider well. A lot of players have taken to social media to do the same. He spent 7 seasons at Penn State, and James Franklin said, T. Frank, that it's a shame that that's considered long in today's college football, but it is. And, I'm sure he had opportunities to either call plays elsewhere or maybe be a head coach, or at least looked into those opportunities, but stayed at Penn State, and surprised, of course, leaving at this juncture, but sometimes an opportunity comes up you can't pass up, and it seems like Notre Dame was that kind of opportunity for him.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily good or bad. It's a thing. Not everything is binary of this is a win or a loss, and sometimes it's just
come
a
on,
thing.
T. Frank. Of course it is. There's always a
I know. It's the worst possible thing I could say in this seat is like, well, it's a little bit of column A and column. Like, people on the internet want to be entertained, and nuance is not entertaining. So let's get into more nuance, Greg. Let's do Between the Lines.
They have both gotten reps with once.
And by the way, this is entirely my fault. I stacked the show with the same topic to start 2 different segments, so there's going to be a lot of overlap here.
I think that, again, to your point, Jim Knowles was pried away from the sitting national champions a couple days after they won the college football playoff. And because of what's going on with the running backs coach search, that was almost a complete afterthought during James Franklin's first news conference of 2025. He still did discuss it, and we'll get into that a little bit, I think, maybe in the spring football modifications part of Between the Lines. But James Franklin was asked about what he's looking for in his next running backs coach as he starts this latest search. And he said, I thought he was pretty forthright, pretty transparent, and it probably is not going to surprise a lot of people, but let's hear what he had to say on that.
There's a list that's probably not as deep as people think of candidates that can come to Penn State. It's about how are you going to get the return on your investment. And what I mean by that is there's some young guys that you can hire that are on an upward trajectory and are going to have really good careers, but you may not get the return on your investment until year 2. And then there's other guys that are much more seasoned, but you want to make sure that they haven't gotten to the point of their career where their career is starting to decline and go in the opposite direction. So you got to find that sweet spot of a guy that's got enough experience, both in coaching and in recruiting at this level, and that we're going to get the return on our investment quickly, because we're just not at a point as a program to come in and have to wait a year or 2 while we're still developing somebody.
Great point. And Sean Fitz of Blue White Illustrate just posted his second version of the running back coaches search hot board. So go check that out, bluewhiteillustrated.com. But part of what Sean talks about in that piece is just what James Franklin, you heard him say here, is that number one, we know that he always has a list. I think that came up like at his intro news conference in 2014, how he plans for staff building. And so we know that that's been a long time thing. But T. Frank, in your mind, how hard is it to balance what James Franklin talked about in terms of career arc trajectory and trying to find somebody who's at the right point of their career?
Yeah.
And also, that's not the only factor. There's a lot of other factors, but that seems to be the important one.
There's 2 things that always cross my mind in this conversation that we don't talk about enough, which is coaches also get coaching and development improvement, and talent evaluation isn't just for football players. Understanding how people communicate, their ability to produce results isn't just about the X's and O's and on the field stuff. getting the right people in the room, getting the right coaches. James Franklin has been fairly good at evaluating talent throughout his career, regardless of whether it's a coach or whether it's a player, And so you look at Anthony Poindexter, a superstar positional coach. Like this roster is dotted even before the commitment conversation, which was another, came up again. The commitment, the alignment, all those things came out recently of having enough money to go and your dream candidates are out there and they're realistic. He's been able to identify guys and bring them into the program to do that even before then, And so I think that I don't know any of these candidates. I don't know what makes a good running back coach, but I do know James Franklin does. And they're in a position where they're going to be able to get the candidate they want within reason and make a sound hire. Because we've talked about this before, and the whole story with Michael Corley and the way some of those things worked out for Penn State in the past of having to pivot in these late cycles. That's not happening anymore. So, that I just find that part interesting that we don't credit enough the storyline of development of a player and a coach kind of in the same conversation of a Deion Barnes, right? A young coach that they took a chance on and is now producing results as seeing the guys that he's coached playing so well, like Abdul Carter at the end of his first season at defensive end. Those things also take time. And there's one thing that James Franklin has talked about. They don't have time to develop coaches. You have to come in and be ready to go.
Right. And I think that's a completely fair expectation. And it also, to your point, goes back to the Deion Barnes situation where they felt like he was here. He was the guy that they wanted. They've certainly added some analysts in the defensive line room that will only strengthen the coaching that's going on there. Obviously, it's very well so far. So, yeah, Penn State, we'll have to wait and see how this search plays out. But certainly the process will be right. We'll see who it leads to. Here's the next thing James Franklin had to say on this running back coach's search.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we're going to have a lot of conversations about as a staff as well. The NFL hiring process has really changed schools like Penn State, because what happens is you either lose a coach to the NFL very late in the process, and now you have to go hire someone who's probably already signed a contract, and that can become costly in terms of buyouts and things like that because it's so late in the process. All the best guys are typically tied up at that point, or an NFL coach an NFL team hires somebody else, and then they take your guy to fill their spot. It is very detrimental to lose people in your organization this late in the process.
And so, of course, what he's talking about there is Notre Dame lost its running backs coach to the NFL. And so Notre Dame poached Jaywan Sider from Penn State, and now Penn State is in the process of working to poach somebody else's staff, which means at some point over the next month, there will be another sitting head coach at a different school who will say probably very close to the same thing James Franklin just said. And yet they all know there's nothing they can do about it because it's just the way the coaching carousel spins.
There's so many moving parts in this that it's hard to kind of like nail down the specific point in which we can untangle this thread, because Penn State's season, as we started the show out saying, their season went long too. And so the idea that you've got to be ready to play football, I guess the saving grace here, let's start this. The saving grace is that they're not changing offensive coordinators right now. That at least whoever walks into the room is walking into an established plan that they're in year 2 on. He's got to fit into the plan. He's got to give his spin on how to make running backs better within that system, but he's got to learn the system, and he's got to be able to integrate into those things. But winter workouts started today, and they don't have a running back coach right now to be a part of the conversation, to get to know those players. The recruiting side and all that is obviously a massive undertaking in itself, but the football criteria of how to build a program, we talk about it a lot in spring football around the blue-white game. We talk about it in training camp. It starts now. It starts in February. So you're penalized for your success for going as long as you have, and then being attractive to candidates at the next level is what he's saying, of NFL teams that go to the playoffs or NFL teams that have coaching searches at that level, which happen after the Super Bowl. Those teams need to find the best talent too, and they're usually the best at the next level and are going to identify the right talent. So I don't know how you fix this. I made this conversation about something else yesterday on the Blue White Illustrated message board. It's a downward spiral for the situation of you one thing feeds into another, feeds into another, feeds into another. And so I don't know how you fix this.
Yeah, I don't know if you can. You have to change the whole calendar of college football. And to do that, you have to get everyone to agree to change it. And that's not going to happen overnight.
Right.
And you're also working.
But you're blowing it up. Like, that's
right.
how you. There's no tweak at this point.
Right.
It doesn't feel like there's a tweak to college football. There is blowing it up.
Yeah, and it's going to require work between college athletics and the NFL, because that's as much a part of this conversation as anything.
Good
as
luck
it
with
relates
that.
to I know there's no doubt, but as it relates to playing the national title game on a Monday, playing it so far after your playoff starts, I mean, all those things are NFL related. We're talking about coaching carousel that's NFL related, and the NFL will have every opportunity to tell college football leaders to go away and not care. But even the slightest give and take may help the sport of college football in that regard. We'll have to wait and see. One other point I'll make, T. Frank, before we move on to the spring practice conversation is, at the very least, when you lose coaches like this, you still have your analyst around. Like, we remember how important Danny O'Brien was during the transition to Andy Kotelnicki. And for Penn State, Charles Walker's the assistant running backs coach. He's listed as an analyst, of course, in the directory. But to have him around, the guy that's been around this program and these running backs for a couple of years, certainly will help in this transition as well. And you got some other people in the building, too, who helped out, too. I think that is an often overlooked but important part of that transition, too. That guy is now helping get through this process, and then he and the new guy have to work together well too. So there's strings to be pulled there. But yes, all told, I think that probably wraps up the running back search conversation for this podcast. Unless something breaks in the next half hour, then of course we will come back here on the BWI Live Show and discuss that. But do you have any final thoughts on that?
Just quickly in the chat, somebody said that DeMarco Murray is staying at Oklahoma. There is reporting. I mean, the information came out almost simultaneously. So, like, is he a part of the conversation? Is he not part of the conversation? I think that is fluid, but I wouldn't put him near the top of the list, kind of in that particular reason. So, just wanted to clean that up. At the beginning of the show, one of the guys that when we sat down to do all of these things and put all this together, our reporting on our side was one thing, and of course, there is other reporting out there from multiple sides. So, appreciate that being pointed out in the chat. But everything that I've learned in the last 15-20 minutes is that nothing is a done deal, but it would be trending away from DeMarco Murray at this point, it feels like. Although I'm this is just kind of an assimilation of the internet very quickly. So take it for what it's worth.
Right. And it could change by the time we wrap up here, or in all likelihood, it'll change seconds after we wrap up here. That's typically how these things work. So stay in tune here on the YouTube channel, your podcast feeds, and also at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com for the latest updates as the running back coach search unfolds. Speaking of that person, they will be here, presumably, for spring practice at Penn State next month. And Penn State is, I guess, modifying its winter workout schedule, and it's also looking at some changes for spring practice too. Here's what James Franklin had to say on that.
I do see us making some modifications to the spring game. We will still have the spring game because I know what it means to this community and the hotels and the bars and the restaurants and the tailgating and all of it. We're working on that now. We may do some more events that we're still working through. I don't want to speak on them too early. I think the biggest modification that we will make is very similar to what we did with Tyler Warren and Olu, 2 years ago, is we'll modify specific guys rather than modify the whole program. Because to me, you're trying to teach a class and you got all this different ability within that class, and you got some people in the class that really need to be challenged at a very high level, and you got some people that just showed up that are entry level, and you're trying to reach all of them, which is challenging. And I think it's the same way with us. Then all these guys that are fighting for jobs and need to be evaluated and need to be developed, they're losing it, and they need it.
22 hours, T. Frank, after hearing James Franklin say that. What was your initial reaction to all of it?
Yeah, so there's about 4 different things all wrapped up in there.
Right.
I guess the part that I'm not sure what the spring game plan is. That's the most cryptic part of that he said he didn't want to get into because they don't know just yet what they want to do with the spring game. So that's where I want to start, because I think you probably have a better sense of that. The things that he said at the end of football, Tyler Warren getting kind of veteran rest days in the spring versus young guys, that's kind of where like I'm pretty dialed in on some of those conversations. But when it comes to the actual spring game, I guess to you, what are the problems with the spring game? And then what are the things that you would anticipate would change about it?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things to set this conversation up. The first is we saw Matt Rule at Nebraska come out and say they are not going to have a spring game due to, in part, the transfer portal being open in the spring. That 10-day window is April 15th to April 25th, which is right, obviously, in the middle of Penn State spring practice. And the same can be said for a lot of other schools. James Franklin did not answer that part of the question at his media availability yesterday, but that's one thing. And then some other schools have canceled or modified their spring game either because they're worried about not having enough guys available. If guys go into the portal, seeing the writing on the wall, and decide not to finish out spring practice, or because they're worried that if they play a televised scrimmage, some guys might do things that would cause other schools to illegally tamper and try and get them to go into the transfer portal. So that was the context of the question. And James Franklin, said they might have an event. Well, okay, what's an event? Like, I feel pretty confident in saying that the blue-white game, as you have seen it for years, other than that one year where they had to modify it because they didn't have enough linemen, the blue-white game that you've seen over it's not going to be a game. Like, event, I thought was a good word.
Will it be more like that, where you're doing 7-on-7 stuff and you're not actually putting all 11 players out there to run football plays?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're looking at like some kind, I don't know, skill competition, or like, I think there's a good reason he didn't want to reveal too many details, because I think they're probably trying to still figure out what will entice people to still come.
Yeah, right? Like that's going to be the biggest thing, is how do you make the Pro Bowl skills competition, basically is what it sounds like, interesting to Penn State fans who are used to seeing dudes blocking and tackling in spring football. So I think that the part of it too that's interesting is, like, it is important evaluation because it's a scrimmage, but fans place so much emphasis on it because of what it is to them, when it is really not worth the squeeze for the program, which has 2 of these that you just don't see during the spring on Fridays or Saturdays, when they get their 15 practices and they can have, I think there's 3 scrimmages. The only difference is you're there for the last one and it's on television. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to be interesting to people. I know what I find interesting, which is football, and I want to get a glimpse at how these guys are progressing, but that's the thing they don't want to show us. And so what's worth it? Is it a kids' day? Is it a carnival? Like, how do you build that out? Because he said it's going to happen because of the ties to the community and the importance of the event for the university and the local community.
Right. And I think that's the key takeaway here. I think if you would poll a bunch of anonymous head coaches, you would find almost zero support for the continuing of the public spring game tradition. There's just, like, to your point, it's a practice where the things that they want to keep behind closed doors, they cannot put in to the practice. Now we have, obviously, the transfer portal and things like that. Like, there's just a lot more cons than pros to doing this. And there's a very obvious reality that it means a lot more to the university and the community than it does just a football program. I'm scrolling here so I don't misquote him, but James Franklin said yesterday that he said, I locked my date in for the spring game a while ago because there's so many things at the university that are built around the game in terms of development, fundraising, all types of events that the university has. And so he ended that by saying, so we don't have a whole lot of flexibility there. And that's just it. You have to. They will do something because of what it means to the state college community and to the business partners of Penn State athletics, and obviously to the football program. But if they had their choice, there's no question in my mind that there would just be no more of this anywhere across college football. But yeah. So let's get into the part of that conversation though about the limiting of reps and getting guys who have been here and done that. He mentioned Olu Fashanu and Tyler Warren specifically as guys in previous years. They were able to do this with, I'm pretty sure KJ Winston and Jalen Reed were guys in that conversation as well. But in your mind, T. Frank, just what is the I don't know if give and take's the right way to put this, but the balance of reps versus rest in 2025 college football spring practice? And
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yes. So here's the problem. In the NFL, we've seen this where there was a degrading of the quality of the product after they took out off season. They limited the off season contact and limited training camps and things like that. There are absolute reasons that they should do that. And they were, I think, right to do that because the strain on the body, recovery, all those things are more important than are you going to miss 1 or 2 tackles or can you get in a tackling form in a different way? But on this level, James Franklin talked about it there at the end. Football education is more important than at the NFL level because this is where they're learning those things maybe for the first time. So it's very hard to eliminate football practice for young players to get better in the offseason and then expect them to get better at any point in their career because here's how the problem is, and the stretch between the two is they just went an extra 2 months, right? So they had an extra 2 months of practice, but that extra 2 months of practice was for playoffs and for a national championship run. You're not doing as much developmental stuff, I imagine, during that time as you would during spring football. So players that are good got better a couple months ago. So they don't need to play in the spring, but you still need to balance out. We need a full roster of people to implement the new defense. They need to get through that. And you need to get young players better at football. Right. You don't just get better magically. This isn't a Madden progression where you wake up one day and your tackling's an 88. Like that is not how humans work. So how do you balance the fact that some of these guys could be playing essentially from August, end of July, really, July 31st, right, practicing from July 31st with a month and a half inch break until May. And they only really get 3 months off. Like that is not a sustainable model for players to be active the entire time. And so there's a balancing act of some guys absolutely need spring football and some guys don't. And finding that balance is, again, another impossible task. How do you split the baby here? It just feels like it's a problem.
Yes, it absolutely is a problem, but it's one Penn State and every other college football program will have to address. I think you make a good point, though. A lot of these guys that are older guys got the kind of reps that they would be focusing on only during the spring in that build up to the playoff. And so I think, as you heard James Franklin say yesterday, they'll focus those guys on jog through reps, but otherwise get the young guys in. The problem, of course, is that you're putting in Jim Knowles' defense. So it's not as easy to say and do on the defensive side of the ball compared to maybe the offensive side.
I don't think we've talked enough either about how massive of an advantage it is to be in the playoff. Yeah. Because teams that go to a bowl game, sure, you get a couple extra weeks of practice. But Penn State played December 5th, right? And then they got like 10 days or a week and a half or something like that. And then they're playing again. And then they're playing again. And they're playing again. And maybe it's not the 7-day grind. Maybe there's 10 days in there instead of or whatever. But Ohio State played until January 20th, meaning they got to practice until January 20th. And Penn State got young players, early enrollees on the practice field, started integrating them into the culture of Penn State. This is how we do things. You need to line up in this line, understanding the fundamental drills so that by the time they get to spring ball, it's not the first time they're doing them and they can actually get better. Reps are super important. And so it is a massive advantage for any team to make the college football playoff. And as a other side of the coin, it's a massive disadvantage not to be in the playoffs. So Penn State, like, this has to be a thing that they do. They have to be in the top 12 teams, or else you are absolutely backsliding and losing ground to your competition if you miss the playoff. And I can sit here and overstate any one thing, but it is really important for them to continue to do that. And the advantage they have coming into this year that they wouldn't have had and they haven't had in previous seasons.
Yeah. One other note, Penn State is going to they usually do 8 to 10 winter workouts. They're going to do, I think, around 6, James Franklin said, on Tuesday. So a slight change there for obvious reasons, how long they played, how long it is still spring practice, so on and so forth. But yeah, this is where your behind-the-scenes people really come into focus. You think about Andrew Nelson and the sports science staff. You think of Chuck Losey and the strength staff. Leanne Loudon, who's the team nutrition, and her staff. There's a lot of people who are not necessarily going to ever get credit for the game-saving tackle or the game-winning touchdown, but it's all the little decisions made now and throughout the course of the next few months to figure out the right ratio of reps versus rest and recovery versus everything else. And so a lot of work coming for those folks for sure.
And you mentioned the support staff. There's another aspect of this that I think is super underrated. And truthfully, this is just kind of a thing I think about all the time this time of year is, when are you having surgery to clean things up? Right. And when can you get back into the weight room to be a part of winter workouts or to be a part of weightlifting and getting your body? James Franklin talked about getting your body better for next year. James Franklin talked about Katron Allen hasn't ever had an off season. So he hasn't actually been able to progress and get better, get faster and stronger, and really develop and hone his traits and his abilities. And that's a big advantage for him coming into his final season, presumably. So guys like Tony Rojas, who, is not going to have that this year, where does that set them back? I drive my wife crazy with this conversation all the time because I just want to know. I want to know the answer. Okay, so like, is he going? What happens when he goes in April when he's cleared, or what happens when he goes in May? And then can he get better? Can he physically improve his body, which takes longer than you think? To not just maybe getting back to the point you were last year doesn't take as long if you're an elite athlete, but to improve, and those margins of improvement are so unbelievably important to actually be better as a football player the next season. Where is that in your, how do you fast track that so you actually get physically better in the off season if you've had to go through a surgery? And can you? Is there enough time? Does the process change? I have 1,000 questions on that aside, and I've tried to ask Chuck Losey them in about 800 different ways in the last 5 years. And like, again, it's like asking for the nuclear codes, I think.
Right. Yes, I think that's a fair way of putting it, but it is a vital aspect of every offseason. And James Franklin was not asked on Tuesday whether or not any players would definitely be out for spring ball due to that kind of thing, whether it's surgery or just general recovery. But we'll find out more about that in March when he speaks before spring practice. But T. Frank, just final thoughts on what was a busy Tuesday with James Franklin and his news conference before we get into what we learned and heard from the class of 2024.
So I guess just the last thing that we talked about as a looming thing, but the portal window happening during spring football is bananas.
Yes.
And so I guess how do you gauge the impact of that during spring football?
I think it has the potential to be a nightmare.
I think James Franklin thought that too. Like, the part I cut out is him like hating the question because of what it was, what it represented. How do you then take advantage of the portal window, right?
Yeah,
so if you're Penn State, and James Franklin talked about being a program that does things the right way and not, luring guys into the portal through back channels, how do you take advantage of it when you're also still focused on keeping your guys in house? So fans are expecting like a big portal haul in the spring. What if the only thing that happens is nothing? Is that a success for Penn State, that they don't lose anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at it as James Franklin said this yesterday, but you're right. They're Penn State fans, and they will look, especially at receiver. Obviously, we don't need to go too much into detail about that because I think everyone's aware, and he said as much yesterday that they will look at receiver in the portal in the spring. But yeah, it's going to be chaos because there's a 10-day window. Again, you don't have to pick your new school no matter what point of the year the portal's open. You don't have to pick your new school before going into the portal. You just have to declare your intent to go into it. And the portal closes one day before the blue-white game. Well, Frank, Penn State's not the only school, of course, that's playing its spring game or spring event, whatever you want to call it, on April 26th. And so, what reason does a player have if they know that they're going into the portal for whatever reason? Either they plan to all along, or they saw the writing on the wall after a month of spring practice that where they're at on the depth chart is not where they want to be. What advantage or what even pro, if you're making a pro and con list, does a player have for sticking around for that? So I think that's the other issue, going back to the conversation we had earlier with trying to map out what this blue-white scrimmage, blue-white game, blue-white event is going to look like. Genuinely, because you don't know what your roster is going to look like. I mean, I'm not saying there's going to be a mass exodus, but I think it would also be very hard for me to believe that you're not going to have a few guys say, I'm going into the portal, I am done with spring ball at Penn State and at other schools. And that's going to make it very hard at some places, maybe not Penn State, we don't know, we'll see, but at some places to have a spring scrimmage, even if they want to. So
we saw it last year when Keandre Lambert-Smith went into the portal before the blue-white game. You know, like we saw this happen last year. My last thought is this is all stupid. This all is ridiculously stupid. It makes no sense.
Yeah. So again, it's just, we've talked about this on plenty of Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and I'm sure it's come up on Thursday as well. But there's been plenty of BWI Live time spent on the fact that the calendar's a mess and no one really has a great way to fix it. And no one really has a great way to mix all these things together at once. Like, so I think some people might be listening to this and might say, well, why doesn't Penn State change the date of its spring game? Well, again, number one, they had to lock it in early. They announced it, was it during the halftime of the SMU game, I think? So they locked it in early because of all the things that surround the blue-white game beside the football aspect. But also, you had to plan for, like, you couldn't sit there that early and plan to have spring practice starting earlier because you were going to lose. Like, no one does that, right? Like, you were planning on your blue-white game being on a timeline that followed winning the national championship. That's what winning programs do. That's just common sense for anything that has to do with competition in athletics. And so, but once you lock it in, you can't say, well, we lost to Notre Dame a round earlier than we wanted to, and so now we're going to move the blue-white game. It doesn't work that way. There's too many other moving pieces. That's what he meant about the flexibility part.
Yeah. Don't they also have to plan it around spring break, where they typically like to start after spring break, so they're not interrupted in the middle of, or at least they're trying to give their guys a couple of days to be away from the program, just to not be doing football 365 days a year. Again, the academic schedule, because this is not professional football, is a part of the conversation, and it just doesn't make any sense.
No, it does not, T. Frank. Well, let's get into the next part of our rundown here on BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel from Blue White Illustrated. As we've said a couple times throughout the show, we heard from Penn State's second-year players, class of 2024 guys who were not available to the media during their freshman season, as has been the long-standing policy under James Franklin, but were available. They've done this now for a couple years, have these guys available for the first time in waves. So we did that at Pagula Ice Arena, since Beaver Stadium is obviously under construction. A lot to get in there to here, T. Frank, but just generally speaking, my takeaway was that these guys are hungry to get more opportunities this year. And know that with the number of veterans in front of a number of guys at key positions, the ones that were able to get on the field in whatever role, special teams or waiting until after they preserve the year of eligibility and then getting opportunities or injuries, giving guys, whatever it may have been, they clearly appreciated it. But they are ready for more, and the guys who didn't get any opportunities are definitely ready to show that they can play at a level worthy of being on the field in their second season at Penn State.
This is just so interesting. I'm not that old, but when I started doing this job, you had the norm. The norm was you contributed your junior season. Right. That was when we expected to see players on the field as a starter for the first time. Maybe you had a role before then, but really it was your third year in the program. And now we're talking about guys as freshmen starting. You know, we've seen that for Penn State. And obviously the better you are at football, you have to get on the field if you're good. Like there is that reality of it's not a blanket rule and not everyone redshirts, but the timeline just feels so accelerated where guys, And this is just
guys are disappointed that they're not playing more as true freshmen. And that's not right.
And it just, to me, I guess I come into this with my perspective of the world, which we only have our own lens to see things through. And I tried to learn football in one off season, and it was overwhelming. And I was working to get a job, and I was working to get a job in football, and I failed the final test because I did not pass the level to know the details you needed. And admittedly, this is for every position on both sides of the ball, not just being a receiver or a defensive tackle. But like, football is so complicated. It is so complex. And that was what I talked about with these guys. I wanted to get a gauge of who they were, where they are in that mental process of, can they contribute in 2025 in a meaningful way, not just as a guy that is out there soaking up reps, because we've seen guys get on the field. Mari Evans was on the field as a freshman, but he was running one route essentially most of the time. That is not being a football player on the field. That is being a gadget player. And if you're going to contribute, you need to be more. And I'm not trying to take shots at Amari Evans. He was a quarterback in high school who wasn't even really a quarterback. He was an option quarterback, and suddenly he's going to be on the field as a freshman. Like, it was just an unrealistic thing to think he was going to be a breakout player. And the ones that are the weird ones. And so now we're talking about all these guys as second-year players, and a lot of them want to, as you mentioned, they're hungry, and that's the mentality they have to be eventually starters and high-level players. But that patience, that push and pull, usually you had more leeway before you got onto the football field. So a guy like Xavier Gilliam, who I talked to, and I think you had a chance to talk to yesterday as well, stated like he very clearly he wants to play. He sees the opportunity, and he wants to be a part of the conversation in that too deep. I think he has to be. I don't think that there's a choice. They need 4 defensive tackles. So that's where we are now in college football. And that goes back to the whole spring football thing. He absolutely needs these reps to get better, but he's also absolutely been playing football since last August.
Right. And so he was one of the guys I thought was most insightful on Tuesday, because, he clearly understood that, getting to the field as a defensive lineman or an offensive lineman as a freshman is very challenging. But he's ready to, he learned a lot this year and is ready to take that challenge head on in year 2. So he's a guy that wants to play. I see Quentin Martin came up in the chat. We talked about him and Corey Smith a little bit earlier in the show as it related to Jaywan Sider leaving. I spent a little bit of time with Quentin Martin, and I mean, again, I think it's interesting for those two guys, and for Cam Wallace, the redshirt sophomore now, who was hurt all last year. But, it's very interesting for those two guys, because I think that they probably at least expected one of Nick Singleton and Katron Allen to not be back. I think that came through yesterday. And now that they're both back, obviously they're going to have to find different ways to get on the field. I mean, certainly in a backup capacity, or if one of those guys would unfortunately have some reason to not be on the field. But otherwise, you're thinking about return game. You're thinking about special packages that Andy Kotelnicki and the staff might dream up. But, certainly that is often the forgotten about part of, Penn State fans, you obviously get excited when Dennis Sutton and Zachy Wheatley and Nick Singleton and Drew Aller and Katron Allen and on and on and on decide to come back. Flip side, of course, is some guys who thought their time was coming are now dealing with a similar roadblock to what they dealt with getting on the field as a freshman, beyond all the other reasons why, in front that you were just talking about from the X's and O's and strength and conditioning standpoint and things like that. But that sort of shined through yesterday, that these guys are happy their veteran teammates are back. They know it makes the program better. Also makes their path to the field harder in year 2. Yeah,
and that impatience when you are talented is absolutely something that comes through. And a lot of guys, it's about a maturity thing. I got a chance to talk to Donnie Harbor. I think his mom was in the chat earlier today.
He's great. I could talk to him too. Yeah, he's fantastic.
Great. Really fun guy. I noticed him almost immediately when he got on campus when we were at Lift for Life, because he just jumped right in and was a part of everything, and had that kind of personality when you sat down and talked to him. But he had, I think, better perspective of he said it was the best thing for him that he redshirted. And I guess it's interesting positionally, like an offensive lineman giving you the perspective of, I'm so glad I redshirted so that a guy from Wisconsin could get used to living in state college, get used to football and all those things, and kind of absorb it and not be overwhelmed and have to perform. having that perspective, also like he had to do some, changing to his body in that time as well, which is also really hard to do. So he gave, I thought, a really kind of grown up view of what the last year was for him. And by the way, looks great. He said he's lost weight after the season again intentionally to get down to where he wants to be. And, I'm really impressed with what he's done over the last probably year since he got into the program. He accepted into the program and started working on transforming himself, because he was a really interesting prospect in the fact that he was obviously athletic. His feet, he could move really well, but was just slow. You could see there was more athleticism there, because I think he made a choice to try and get big in high school and didn't do it the right way. Just put on weight instead of good weight, and having to flip that switch and transform like that is really hard. So credit to a guy who was able to go through all that process too. A really interesting guy to talk to.
Yes, he absolutely was. So was Ethan Grunkemeyer. Of course, we heard a little bit from him at the Fiesta Bowl, moving into that role of number 2 quarterback. And one of the topics he, of course, spent some time being asked about was the new receivers on campus. And I mean, look, there's just not. Those guys haven't been here that long, and so if you're looking for extreme amounts of insight from any of these guys, Ethan Grunkemeyer or Tyser Denmark or whoever it might be, about the newcomers, especially at receiver, it's just a little too soon. But sounds like they all have acquitted themselves well across the position groups from the transfer portal haul that arrived back in January. So I thought that was notable. But I think James Franklin kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of that conversation when he said, we'll know more after winter workouts, and we'll know more after the strength draft gets some testing done with these guys, and we'll know more after spring practice. And I know that waiting is no fun, and that we will be here 3 days a week, at least on the BWI Live Show, to make sure that when that time to wait is over and the details and everything are there, we'll provide them to you right away. But yeah, I thought that, there were a lot of questions kind of in that same vein, that it was just a little too early to get true info from guys on. But when you talk about the development themselves, you could tell a lot of these guys changed their body during their first season on campus. Some were, as you noted, going up in weight. Some were coming down in weight. Some were just reshaping themselves and staying right around the weight that they were. But T. Frank, I know you talked to a couple other guys. I did as well. Give me the guy that comes to mind when I ask you this. The one guy you went into not expecting to get insight, intel, whatever it might be from, that stuck out to you. I think Donnie Harbor obviously is probably safe to say one, but anyone other than him that comes to mind for you?
Xavier Gilliam was awesome. I like guys who are, you get a beat on what their personality is pretty quickly, and then you kind of know how to talk to them, and you can kind of, not pump them for information, but just like, I wanted to get to know these guys and kind of get an assessment of like how they tick. And he was super thoughtful and gave really great answers, and was, not just smart, but insightful. Like, you can be book smart and also not really give a lot of insight, but he was a guy that seemed to have a really good perspective on things. And I just didn't know him at all. And so some of the things he was talking about and some of the clarity he gave to his situation, I thought was super cool. So that was one guy. And then it's funny, like Cooper Cousins because Cooper Cousins is in the chat right here. Everyone's excited about Cooper Cousins. No, that's not it. Where was it here? Anyway, he came up earlier in the chat. He's almost too perfect to really like dig into from an insight perspective. Everything he said was too perfect. And not saying that it's phony. I'm just saying, like, he was built in a lab to play football. So if there are any questions, you already know the answers, because the answer is football. What's the reason? Football. What does he want? Football. What does he eat? Football. What does he look like? Football. There you go. Like, Cooper Cousins. You've right. He is as driven and as talented and as focused as you might think. And so that all came across as somebody who was also at the same time outgoing and interesting, and you can talk to him. And it just was one of those where I was like, I didn't read about him yesterday, because I'm like, it is known. Like, these things are known. What about you?
I didn't get any time to talk to him yesterday either, but he's another one of those guys that comes to mind in terms of, look at what he did as a freshman and say to yourself, he is on the trajectory of a guy who's going to play in year 2, and especially impressive at a position that's hard to play at early in your career. The problem is Penn State's returning all the guys that started at the positions he played last year. So interesting to see how Phil Troutwine, Frank Leonard, and the group along the offensive line, of course, in conjunction with Andy Kotelnicki, find a way to get him reps this upcoming season. But no, I mean, I thought Tyser Denmark was really interesting to get some time with. He's obviously a guy we've talked about at length on this show. Talking to him a little bit about his return game work in the past, and I think that's something he's hoping to bring to Penn State this season if he can win a job there. And so that's something to keep an eye out for. Certainly feels like he's progressed, that he wants to get faster. A lot of times you listen to these interviews and they're all kind of the same. Everybody wants to get bigger, faster, compete, be more explosive, so on and so forth. But I thought getting to spend a little bit of time with him was interesting. And same with Caleb Brewer. And I guess that's the one I'll leave with, is that guy that wrestled his senior season of high school, so did not get here until the summer, was along the offensive line, of course, where it's hard to play from the get-go to begin with, especially when you come in the summer. But it seems like he's made a lot of good strides too, T. Frank. So when we talked earlier in the show about just the continuity of that offensive line and the way it's been built, you should feel good about the long-term outlook for this bunch based on the guys we got to talk to yesterday. I know there's a lot of veterans at the top right now, obviously, but you should feel good about the long-term outlook for that group as well.
Yeah, and the fact that a lot of these guys are doing the right things behind the scenes. That's kind of the major takeaway, was that it's one thing to have the time to do it. It's another thing to actually do it. And the number of people that have the perspective of maximizing every single day, and talking to Max Granville and some of these guys who bring that perspective with such an intensity and a focus of, I want to get better every single day, and I want to make sure that I'm maximizing all my opportunities. That's not every person, and that's not every player. And maybe some of them are saying the right things, but you got to look like the talk, right? And that's half of it. And so like that, I think that you had a lot of guys that showed examples of that you have been putting in the work to be on that trajectory, including Donnie Harbor. One last thing that I just remembered. A lot of this is these guys that we haven't seen them, right? So the last time we got to see them was in high school. So I'm going off of my understanding of who they are based on their high school film. And I asked Ethan Grunkmeyer, it seems like you like Patrick Mahomes quite a bit based on the way you played in high school. And he's like, yeah, absolutely. So, trying to get to understand personality styles. And I'm not saying he's going to come out here with the faux hawk or anything like that, like Dylan Raiola, but playing style, some of the keys that you see and some of the things you want to know about what's he going to be like when he gets on the field. I'm not saying he's going to go out there and run around after the play on every single play, but it is something in his game that he thinks about. And it is something that he has tried to put into his tool belt early in his career. So just some cool insights in that. And for me, it's almost like a personal justification of like, I knew it. I'm so glad, like 2 years worth of wondering, and now I get the answer.
Well, you can always join us here on the BWI Live Show for answers, and of course over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, where we will soon have answers on the Penn State running back coaches search. T. Frank, Ryan, and Sean will be back tomorrow with the BWI Live Recruiting Show. Penn State wrestling is rolling along. Penn State basketball, of course, coverage there over at Blue White Illustrated with Nate Bauer. And football continues to be in the news, T. Frank, and it will be. So we will catch you next time. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. It's been BWI Live. We'll catch you next time here on the YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcast.